Well, thank you, David. It's a pleasure to meet Laura and Melissa tonight. Thank you so much for honoring us to be here. Since this was going to be a fairly long speech, not too long, I actually wrote out a big long speech and I tried it out on my husband, Jason. It's Jason Lahman, by the way. And he said, that's really boring. We have every morning over breakfast, we have sort of our symposium, we yak. Jason is a professor of European history, specializing in technology and particularly in the history of automata. And he teaches lectures at San Francisco State and occasionally at Portland State as well. In Portland, we've recently moved up to a small farm just south of Portland. So he's going to sort of ask questions and I'm hopefully going to be able to answer them. And he'll also fill in some things that I probably might miss.
Well, just hearing about Carlos, I was whispering to Daniel, I said, this is a man after our own heart, because we are not only people who are passionate about the arts, but also passionate about the way that the arts intersect with medicine. As Daniel said, I'm a historian of technology, although I also have a background in art history. So we're going to hopefully be bringing these things to bear on the story that we're going to be telling to you.
So we thought we would start with a very short 3-minute film that a friend of ours, Jason Lahman, made. And it just gives you a little bit of overview of who I am, where I've been, and what I've been doing recently. Okay? In the early 1980s, I was really very successful as a two-dimensional artist. I was having shows at museums and I had galleries all over the world and things were going very, very well. And then in 1984, I was diagnosed as HIV positive. And all those things that I was and had been built around me all of a sudden didn't really mean very much. Because for me, what I'd really always wanted to do, and I had done back in college, was to create sculpture. So all those sculptures that I had been thinking about for all those years since college, all those sculptures that were in my sketchbooks for all those years, they needed to come out. And it took being faced with death for me to do that, to finally say, this part of my life, this part of my career is over. This new part is starting. The images that have been in my head and in my sketchbooks for all those many years had a lot to do with flocking patterns. And by that I mean when you see flocks of birds moving together, holding together mysteriously, or schools of fish moving, or even wind going over a field of grass, or even waves rolling in. Everything in those different patterns seem interconnected. You're not always sure how they are connected, but they are connected. They are moving as one. And that has always been so satisfying for me to see. And I think it sort of reminds us that we are all connected, that everything is connected, and we can't always see those connections. So for me to try to translate those ideas, those kinds of movement into sculpture was what I really wanted to do. And I think if you look at my sculptures, you could really see that they're made of lots of elements, smaller elements that make up one or two large shapes, and they all move together and they create one thing. They're all separate, but they create one thing, just like we do. We are all connected. The very first public commission that I got was for a medical center, and it was an amazing opportunity and privilege to be able to create a piece for a space that transformed what was basically a fairly cold space into something inviting and warm and even entertaining, that you could actually stand there and look at it and enjoy it and not just pass through on your way to a doctor's appointment being stressed. It could be a place where you could calm yourself. You know, a few years ago, I was in a lobby of a hospital that I'd done a mobile for, and a woman was being wheeled through in her wheelchair, and she stopped me. I was photographing my piece, and she said, "Are you the artist?" And I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "You know, I come through this lobby about twice a month for chemotherapy, and this is the only thing that makes me feel good when I'm here. In fact, I even look forward to seeing it."
So when we were first having discussions about what you wanted to talk about tonight, there were sort of three key things. Obviously, there was the art, there was the issue of the pandemic of AIDS, and then there was also activism, because activism has been an important part of your life for the last 25 years. But we got to thinking about, the meaning of activism and how that's related to the idea of activation. And if you're thinking about activism, particularly if you're thinking about how art is used, in activism, you're trying to get people's attention. You're trying to pull their attention towards the topics and the situations that you have a passion for. But how do you do that with art? And so how does art activate us if we're thinking about that?
Well, I like to think about, even before art, there's hopefully a shared experience that people have when they are in nature. Like if you're looking at a beautiful sunset or the ocean, something where it's an unmediated response. You are just overtaken by the beauty. And that, I'd like to transfer that to art. There's some art, in my experience, that has done that to me, the same kind of experience. Here's a wonderful Caspar David Friedrich with somebody experiencing that awe in nature. And there's a group of painters in the 19th century, and what they were trying to do was create a sublime, what they called a sublime experience.
Yes, Caspar David Friedrich is a really interesting character because for those of you who know his work, you know that the hallmark of it is a human figure in some kind of a really spectacular natural environment. And so as the viewer, you are not only looking at a great work of art, you also are having a kind of a vicarious experience of being in one of these sort of heightened situations. You're at the top of a mountain, you're standing in front of a sunset. And as Daniel said, the word sublime, not all of us know that this thing, this idea has sort of a long history. And in the late 18th, early 19th century, there were aesthetic philosophers who were trying to come up with theories about what is the sublime. When I teach my courses on history and culture, very often also technology, one of the ways I like to get my students thinking is to go to etymology. So I put a word out there, and then I show them sort of not only the roots of the word, but sort of the different meanings that the word can take on. And so if you look at sublime, obviously we usually think of it as an adjective, right? It's something of such excellence, grandeur, or beauty that it inspires great admiration or awe. And obviously, if we're thinking about something like Caspar David Friedrich, that's certainly what we're talking about. And I didn't know this, but also sublime is a verb. So if we're thinking about how the sublime, how a great work of art, how nature can impact us, we are, in a sense, perhaps it's metaphorical, moving from a solid state to a state that's less than solid. And that's certainly something that's very important in your work.
One of the first times that I can remember feeling this feeling of being overcome by art was when I was an art student in London and going to the British Museum, and there were these figures there. They're called Nereids. They're personifications of the waves. And it was the first time that I saw sculpture that it didn't necessarily move, but in my mind, except for somebody like Alexander Calder, sculpture was pretty solid, stationary. And here were these amazing sculptures that just personified movement. The figures were in movement, the fabric around them was in movement, and I was so overcome that I got dizzy and I had to sit down because I thought I was going to fall down. And it turns out that there is actually a syndrome called the Stendhal syndrome. And it describes that very thing. Stendhal, when he was visiting Florence, was constantly overcome by beauty, and he had to sit down. So he got a whole syndrome named after him.
Well, one of the other things that we often talk about when we have these discussions about art is that when you're having an experience like if you want to call it the Stendhal syndrome, I had it the first time I was in Notre Dame in Paris. I literally had to take a seat because I wasn't sure if my legs were going to hold me up. You are sort of being moved into a completely different state of consciousness.
And as the thing said, it's not an intellectual response.
You're having a physical experience.
It's a physical, visceral, emotional, it's a heart and body response. So, I mean, there's places like the Pantheon, if you've ever been there, that's certainly a place that just is awe-inspiring. And that you feel it in your body. And you're going to see that that's what I'm really aiming for in my art. It's not an intellectual response. It's getting to people through their bodies, through their hearts, and maybe activating them through that.
But also, I just want, since we're talking about the Pantheon, we're also talking about the personifications of the waves, this idea of something so solid, things that are made of stone, but you're having this experience because of their relationship to space. So something solid, something not solid are working together to transport you.
So my first mentor, idol, whatever you want to call it, was Alexander Calder. So here was a sculptor who was dealing with movement, color, space, and doing it so brilliantly. He did what nobody else had done. He took sculptures off the ground, hung them in space, and made them move. He got his colors, the very simple primary colors, when he went to Mondrian's studio and he saw Mondrian's paintings and he said, these should move. And he went back to his studio and started making these mobiles. And one of the many things I love about the work is the negative space is equally important as the solid pieces. They're permeable. You can almost imagine yourself moving through them. And they can carve out space. I don't know if you've seen the National Gallery, the East Wing in Washington. There's a huge mobile by him, and it feels like it's actually carving out the space. I was lucky enough when I was 15 years old, I was bicycling through Lincoln Center, and I came upon Alexander Calder, my favorite artist, and he was installing that piece right in front of the Vivian Beaumont Theater with his 4-year-old grandson, who is now the head of the Calder Foundation. And I got to go up and tell him that he was my favorite artist, and he was very nice. It was a wonderful experience.
Well, so in thinking about some of the other artists who have inspired you, I think some of the themes that people here are going to be picking up on are the things that we're mentioning about the solid being not solid.
Yeah.
But also, what about somebody like Rothko?
Well, Rothko is a perfect example of the solid and the not solid. Here he's dealing with, if you know his work, it's mostly about rectangles, but they're not solid rectangles. They're soft. They've got this penumbra around them. The edges, you just can't tell where the outside starts and the inside begins. And that's something that has always fascinated me, this permeability. And also, his colors are pretty amazing. Two other artists, there's two brothers, Gabo and Pevsner. They were also doing something that had never been done before. These from the early 20th century. They were working with materials that were transparent, and particularly loved their work. You're invited in and through the work because of the transparency. And there's another one of, I can't remember which is Gabo and which is Pevsner, but they're amazing sculptors. And one of my all-time favorites, who I really just got introduced to about 20 years ago, is an amazing artist named Hilma af Klint. She's a Danish artist, and even though people like Kandinsky and Kupka really get the credit for inventing abstract art, she did it 6 years before that. And she didn't get the credit for it, first of all, because she was not an intellectual. She did not write a treatise about it like Kandinsky did. She was a medium. She channeled these paintings, and these paintings
are huge.
And I don't know how many of you know this, but this is something that's really been opening up in art history for the last 25 years, and that is the connection in the late 19th century between these artists like Hilma, many of them women, not all of them household names, who were very involved in theosophy, Eastern religion, things that would sometimes be labeled under the occult label. But they were really trying to find a new language that would connect the spirit world to the physical world. And Kandinsky wrote a very famous book called The Spiritual in Art. And so decades later, a lot of these guys who were also a part of this movement were, as you say, writing manifestos. But so much of the credit is actually due to people like Hilma, who were doing it, if not at the same time, then certainly earlier. But there's been a denigration of them.
She knew that her work was not going to be understood by the people of her time. When she died, she had all of her work crated up and said the crates could not be opened for 20 years. As it turned out, it was another 40 or 50 years before they opened those crates and found these amazing, magnificent pieces of art.
So the Serpentine Gallery in London 2 years ago did the first major show outside of Denmark of her work. And just to give you an idea of the size of these things.
They're big.
These were in crates, since 1944, waiting to see the light of day.
Yeah, pretty amazing to be in their presence. One thing more about the sublime, which was important to a lot of these artists, was the largeness, the size of the art. They wanted it to sort of extend past your field of vision, so you would literally be enveloped by it. Another artist that I love is Ruth Asawa. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She's a San Francisco artist who just died a couple of years ago. She, when she was at Black Mountain College, she spent the summer in Mexico and learned how to do basket weaving with steel wire. And she started creating these amazing sculptures, which are all about the permeability, about inside and outside, and they're they're like body-like. I mean, it's like an X-ray. When you think of the X-ray, which is late 19th century, 20th century invention, it gave us a way to see through things, and that is something that has always fascinated me, to be able to see the inside of things. And you're going to see that in sculpture that's coming up.
And incidentally, a lot of these people who were involved in seances, theosophy in the late 19th century, when X-ray technology first came into being, there was a lot of excitement that perhaps there might be a technological way to actually capture the spirit. Another one of Ruth's. And on a side note, we were very lucky for 4 years. We actually got to live in a house in San Francisco designed by Ruth's husband, Albert Lanier,
which was sublime.
Quite sublime. And many of her sculptures had actually hung in that house.
Yeah, so the ghost of her pieces were with us, which was
It was important for you.
Yeah. Another artist, I don't know if you know his work, is James Turrell, who has basically done away with the sculpture completely. He was one of the founders of what's called the light and space movement in Los Angeles. And his work is about light and space, where the art really completely surrounds you. It is, it's amazing.
It's sublime.
It's sublime to be in the presence of his work. And he's now creating this huge piece in Arizona called Rodin Crater. He bought a crater like 40 years ago and has been excavating it. And this is one of the pieces. It's like a stairway to heaven. He does these cutouts, which are, that's the sky. The blue part of the previous slide is the sky. And as the sky changes color, the piece changes. So it's really, once again, not mediated by the intellect. It's a very visceral experience.
And so often, if you're reading art criticism, if you're sort of paying attention to the way a lot of art writers will write about things like this, they're sometimes ignoring this really important physical, spiritual experience.
Yeah. And his work was really pretty much ignored for a long time, until recently. The other artist is my teacher, Anthony Caro. And even though Mr. Caro dealt, or Sir Anthony Caro, dealt in heavy metal pieces, his pieces were also very permeable, very open, very inviting.
And playful.
Yeah, very playful. Yeah, we just saw his last show in New York when I was there, his last pieces, and they're using plexiglass and steel. So there's just like in and out. And it's just, they're just,
I mean, these things weigh several tons, and yet
Yeah,
at the same
but
time,
they're
when you're
so
looking at
light.
them, they seem to be dancing.
yeah. And so when I was in art school in London, I took the roof over as my studio. I was doing pieces out of fabric that were just moving with the wind. And one of the other professors was William Tucker. And when he came to critique my work, he said, art or sculpture shouldn't move, which of course set me off big time, because I thought that's exactly what sculpture should do, was move. And then when I saw his work, I realized, well, his sculpture doesn't move. It weighs 5 tons. And it looks sort of like, well, you decide what it looks like. Not to put him down, but he put me down. So now we're even.
But when you came back, though, sculpture was not what you worked on.
When I was in grad school, I was also making prints. I was really fascinated by woodblock prints, particularly Japanese woodblock prints, and Edvard Munch also did some beautiful prints. And I really became fascinated by using material of wood, just really collaborating with the wood. And that's what these pieces were about. And the person who really helped guide me was in college. When I was in London, I read this book called The Poetics of Space. I don't know if you know Gaston Bachelard. He's a French phenomenologist. And this book has been one of my guidebooks for a long time. What he talks about in this book is spaces that can help us be in a state of reverie. Places like basements and attics and corners and forests. And he felt that especially modern people needed these spaces for reverie. We were bereft of those places. And so the prints that I was working on were really about trying to create images of those spaces. So like I loved taking canoe trips and going to little coves where there would just be water lilies, and that was my place for reverie. So I did this piece.
And these are also quite large.
They're quite large. And using, you can see the water, I'm using the wood grain in the piece, really collaborating with the wood. This is a really large piece, about 8 feet wide, called Into the Woods.
And one of the things that I'm just noticing now too is there's always, well, not always, but very often there's a way into these pieces.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, there's invitations. This is probably, it's a picture of one of the most famous contemplative places in the world. It's Ryoanji, which is a Japanese Zen garden in Japan, which was made for contemplation. That's its purpose. And I loved it. This was happening in the late 70s, early 80s. As many of you will remember, 1981 was when AIDS was sort of reared its ugly head in America. And my partner at the time, the gentleman on the right, was Steve Richards, who was an immunology researcher in San Francisco. And when the AIDS epidemic hit, he went to work with Jay Levy, who was one of the premier AIDS researchers in America, in his lab at UCSF. And in 1984, he drew our blood and took it into the lab. The AIDS test was not available to the public. He took it into the lab and found out that we were both HIV positive. And this was obviously life-changing experience. As I said in the little movie, I gave up all my printmaking. I let go all of my staff. And I realized I'd had so many ideas for sculptures in my head, and I did not know how long I was going to live. At that time, AIDS was a death sentence, and it would be a death sentence for the next 12 years. And so I didn't know if I had a year or however long. And I had these ideas for sculptures, and I felt that if I did not do them, I would not die happy. So it was a devastating time. Particularly San Francisco was really devastated. I lost all my friends, except maybe one or two. Imagine that you go to a party next week, and there's 10 people there. And then you go to the same party next year, and 8 of them are dead. That's what it was like in San Francisco. 80% of my cohort died. The San Francisco Gay Chorus, Gay Men's Chorus, did this amazing sort of symbolic picture. This is from 2005. The men in white symbolize the original members of the chorus. The men in black symbolize all the people who they had lost in the chorus. So you get a feel of what the devastation was like. It was a time of hopelessness, fear. It was a very hard time, particularly at San Francisco. The theme that really sort of came to me because my community was disappearing around me was the idea of what I call the presence of absence. Their absence felt very, very palpable. And I knew I needed to make art about that. And even before my diagnosis, I was doing prints, and all our friends were dying, and I was making prints of empty rooms, empty chairs, and ironically, I didn't even realize what I was doing. These were the images that I was drawn to, and it wasn't until later I realized, well, of course they're empty rooms. Of course they're empty chairs. I did a series of prints, or these were collages with rowboats, empty rowboats, and I had a show of them, and somebody came up to me and said, why aren't there any people in the rowboats? And when that person asked me that, I realized I hadn't even thought about that. That it was just, that's what I needed to do, was empty rowboats. It didn't even occur to me to put people in there. And then I started doing horizons, which just took everything out of the picture. It was just about light. And because of the time, a lot of these were pretty dark. Once again, I don't think I was consciously aware of what I was doing. In retrospect, I could see it, but when I was doing it, not necessarily conscious of what I was doing. It was about this time. Oh, Jason, you can talk about this next thing.
It was interesting. When Daniel and I first got together 12 years ago, he showed me the pieces that we're going to be showing you in a minute. And I was actually studying medieval history at the time. So we started having these discussions about reliquaries. And so many of you probably already know this, but it really is fascinating that for most of recorded history, human beings have incorporated relics into their rituals, into their services. Because if you think about the history of humankind, for most of time, we were illiterate. We did not communicate, or we didn't read. And where the power was stored was in objects, was in images. And so if you're thinking about the European Middle Ages, all over Europe were these incredible objects. This is the finger of a saint, I think made in the 13th, or the object was made in the 13th or 14th century. And these things would be brought out, and the people would have these really incredible experiences with them. And it's not just in the European world. I just love these, and my students always flip out when I show them these. The head relics, the hand relics, the objects made to contain these bits and pieces of holy people that would very often have really incredible impact on those who came into contact with them. But certainly in the East, in the Jain world, in the Buddhist world, there are stupas, there are temples that are built around these holy objects. And I particularly love these. These are from Thailand, and they're little houses that are made to welcome the spirits in.
And just a little story about that. When I was in Bali, they have, I don't know if you've been to Bali, but they have festivals all the time. They love their festivals. And one of the things, their religion is a really amalgamation of lots of different religions. But one of the things they do is, for the festival, they will take like a stick or a rock, just any old stick or rock, and invite the gods to come down and inhabit that object. And then they will venerate and revere that object. And then at the end of the festival, they'll kindly ask the gods to go home, which I think is very smart. But it's the whole idea that these reliquaries, these things that hold powerful objects. So I started doing these pieces that I called reliquaries. Each one was named after one of my dead friends. And because people were dying so fast that there was no time to mourn. And the mourning process is, especially in some religions like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the mourning process is necessary to let the spirit go. And we didn't have that luxury because people were dying so rapidly.
And for the most part, in our contemporary American culture, we don't have that either.
Yeah.
There's no time and there's no place to usually to connect with the material remains.
And no ritual.
Yeah.
And so I was trying to take the spirits of my friends and finding homes for them. And these were my spirit houses. Sure. When I finished these pieces, I was going to a gay gym in San Francisco, and that was the height of the AIDS crisis. And the gym was a place where these men, many of whom are dead now, were trying to stay alive. I mean, their body from the inside was being taken over by the virus, but they were at least able to go and try to keep the outside together. And I noticed that there were the leather bench covers, and they had a beautiful patina to them. So I prevailed upon the manager of the gym to let me have them in exchange for a sculpture. And so I would take them home, and I would lay them out on the studio floor and look at them and just know that they were important, but just not know what to do with them. And this happened month after month. And then maybe a year after I had them, I tacked one up to the wall, and it's that center one, I think, and it literally blew me across the room. It was sort of like the Shroud of Turin, except this was a repository of the sweat, the body oils, the abrasion, the DNA of all these thousands of men who were trying to stay alive. And they really felt like holy objects to me. And I felt the need, once again, to create reliquaries. So I built these, they're like packing crates, really. They're very rough on the outside, but inside they're lined with black felt, and they have copper around the edges, and then they're covered in plexiglass. And these pieces have, and they're still actually traveling in museum shows around the world. There's one that's going on right now. And their impact is really strong. And one thing that started happening around that time, Jason can talk about that a little bit, is that curators who were like either priests or nuns who were doing curation about art that connected with religion saw these pieces.
It was interesting because these are people who are academics, these are people who are intellectuals, but they also are people of the cloth. I mean, in this case, in the two cases I know we're talking about, one was a nun and one was a priest.
This show was curated by the Sister Wendy of Australia, Rosemary Crumlin, fabulous woman.
And this is where you first discovered Hilma.
Yeah, Hilma Flint. This show had like all my favorite artists. It had Matisse, it had Rothko, Picasso. I mean, it was like, I felt like I had died and gone to heaven. So that's where I discovered Hilma Flint.
The connection, though, between these old holy objects was something that they were certainly saying.
Yeah, they were. I mean, lots of them were talking about the Shroud of Turin. And also Veronica's veil, if you're familiar with that, which is also known as the sudarium, which literally means sweat cloth. And that's what these really were. These were the repositories of sweat, and how one of them that this guy owns, he called me several years after he bought it and said, a halo of salt crystals has formed around the head. And it was like my little miracle. It's like, how did that happen?
Temperature change.
Temperature, who knows? So here's a picture of the veil of Veronica.
And an actual relic purported to be the veil.
Yeah, so.
But this happened a lot. These were picked up by a number of different curators.
There were show after show that had to do with religion and art. And I'm not a particularly religious person, and I'm also Jewish, and these tended to be Christian related museums or shows, which was interesting. And if you looked at one of the big pieces, there is a shape in the middle of it. It's a very ghost-like shape. And sort of going back to Rothko, what I loved about the shape in the middle of these leather pieces was its permeability. You couldn't see any sharp edges. And I loved that about it.
And the material of this is?
And so I decided I want to see if I could make three-dimensional sculpture that also doesn't have hard edges, that gives you a way in that is permeable, that has as much negative space as positive space. because our bodies are made up of cells and molecules and atoms that are mostly empty space. We are permeable. We don't look it, but we are permeable. And in that way, we are all connected. So this is made out of bronze mesh, and it's lots of like little leaves of bronze mesh in that same shape. And it's also a suspended piece.
And it's life size.
Yeah. And then I also started working in glass. I got glass that was rejects from glass blowers. I would go through their trash and it's called cullet. It's what's left over. And it's a really beautiful material. It's sort of a heavy material, but I felt because it's glass and it's suspended, and once again, there's so much negative space that it gave you a way in. And also they felt, once again, I started this piece because I had this glass and I didn't know what to do with it. And my second partner, Tim, kept saying, you've got to make a sculpture. You've got to make a sculpture out of this stuff. So I finally started a head, and then Tim died, and I just couldn't work. I would go in the studio, sort of make a 360-degree turnaround, and then I'd walk out. And then eventually, just little by little, I started making this piece. And Tim, I kept hearing Tim's voice in my head, you've got to make this. You've got to make these pieces. And this, coincidentally, he died in 1986, which is also 96, which was also the year when the protease inhibitors came out, which made AIDS a manageable disease. So there were so many people who had been HIV positive for a while, who had given all their money away, or spent all their money, or cashed in their life insurance policies, and all of a sudden they were going to live. And there is a syndrome named after this experience. It's called the Lazarus syndrome. They were brought back to life from the, really death's door. So I call this piece Lazarus, because I had been expecting to die and I didn't, and I still haven't. What's next?
Beam Me Up, Scotty.
Beam Me Up, Scotty. Yeah, so I did this piece because I wanted, it's another glass piece, but it's surrounded by thousands of crystal beads. I wanted the feeling of the figure to actually be lifted up, sort of like an ascension.
And who ended up buying
This woman bought this piece from the gallery, and she told me the reason she bought it was that her son had recently died. And this was, a way for her to stay connected with her son, which was very moving to me. What slide is that? It's blank.
Let's see.
What does that say?
So making whole what has been broken. Again, we've been talking, obviously with Calder, all of these different artists, there's this idea, we've talked about heaviness and lightness, but also about many pieces being brought back together. And that's something that certainly was showing up in the glass pieces and the bead pieces.
Right. And really from my work from then on, it was about making lots and lots of little small pieces into larger shapes. And one of the places where I got this idea was from the Kabbalah. And Jason's much more of an expert on this, so he's going to talk about it.
Well, I have to say what's sort of interesting, what's been an interesting thing in our personal relationship is that, Daniel's, I always say, he's a nice Jewish boy from New York. Secular family, but his grandparents were Orthodox Jews from Russia. And Daniel's grandfather was a scribe. And he was at shul pretty much, when he was retired every day, at the synagogue every day.
Yeah, he was a scholar as well.
And and I was raised by an evangelical Christian family. So I went to church 4 days a week. I went to Bible school. The Bible was sort of, the King James Bible, a little different than your Bible, but poured into me. And so one of the things that's been a part of our relationship is talking about your Jewish history, and then me talking about my Christian history. And we started having these conversations about Kabbalah because when I was doing my master's, I was taking a lot of classes on Jewish history. So for those of you who don't know, just in a nutshell, the main idea behind Kabbalah, which is a medieval mystical tradition that comes out of Spain, at the beginning of time, when God is creating the universe, he or it makes these vessels to contain his glory. And according to Isaac Luria, one of the great scholars of this period, these vessels, which are known as the Sephirot, couldn't handle the glory of God. They just couldn't handle it, and they broke. And so there's this idea in Judaism, tikkun olam,
which is to care of the world, means care of the world.
to put things back together. And
that it's the job of good people to gather the pieces and put the world back together.
you're helping God out by doing good works, right?
And another translation of Tikkun Olam is constructions for eternity.
But more about that later.
More about that later.
The first piece that I ever saw of Daniel's was this transport. And do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I saw pictures of this boat that was excavated from below a pharaoh's tomb in Egypt. And here's a picture of the boat, and it's just a beautiful shape. Pharaoh used to go up and down the Nile in this, but it was modeled after the god Ra would take a boat and sail through the underworld every night and come up at the other end. And while he was in the underworld,
he would do battle with this primordial serpent called Apophis, the spirit of chaos. So it was the job of the sun every night when he left the world to basically do battle to make sure that in the morning the sun would rise again and that the forces of chaos wouldn't overcome the world.
So these pieces really spoke to me about, I and my friends who were left were traveling through our own underworld. And yet there did seem to be hope. I mean, the scientists were working so hard, and I would not be here without these amazing biochemists who have created these amazing drugs.
A few years ago, this piece was moved from into its current home, which is displayed, it's like the 14th or 15th floor of this building down right by the Bay Bridge in San Francisco. And so it was Daniel's assistant and I went down there and with these very tiny paintbrushes actually cleaned all of the glass. And while we were there, the sun came through that window and lit up the entire piece. And it was quite an amazing experience to see this.
And I love the shape so much that I did another piece that was about 60 feet long called Embarking, which was the same shape, but there were 7 of these large boats made out of aluminum. I think they are somewhat hopeful. It's like, we're on our way to something. I don't know when David came to me, but I have a friend named David Gear who is professor at UCLA was the World Arts and Culture Department, but thanks to him, they created a new department called, Global Health and Art and Global Health. And what he does, what this department does is they create these projects all over the world. One of my favorite ones is he went to India and found artists all over India, because India was really being plagued by HIV. He found artists all over India who were performance artists, visual artists, musicians who were doing AIDS education through their art. And he gathered them together in a conference, and they never met each other. They didn't know each other's work. He got international funding for them. Some of the people were doing AIDS education still out in front of AIDS hospitals in India. One of my favorites was there's women who in the marketplace in northern India traditionally would have these scrolls that they would unroll, and they would tell the stories of like the Bhagavad Gita, just about the different Hindu gods. And what they did was they adapted the story of AIDS. They would tell the story of AIDS in the marketplace. And the healthcare workers found out about this, so they would set up a booth right next to them. They'd be handing out condoms. They'd be educating people about this. And now, thanks to my friend David, this is happening all over India.
Well, one of the things, if we're talking about activation and activism, that David did was he has brought together people whose work relates to everyday people and communicates a message to them through traditional forms of art.
Yeah, I remember his son, who was really young at the time when David started this project, which was called Make Art, Stop AIDS. His son said, "Daddy, how can art stop AIDS?" And David basically said, this is the only way that it's going to happen, because it's going to get, especially to people who are illiterate, it's the only way it's going to get to them is through their art and through their heart. David was planning an exhibition that was going to be traveling around the world, and one of my leather pieces was going to be in it. But he said, we'd like to have another one of your pieces, and what do you have? And I said, you know, I have been saving my pill bottles for the last 10 years, and I had no idea why. I mean, every shelf in my studio was filled with shopping bags full of pill bottles. And so I thought, I'm going to make a figure, a life-size figure out of pill bottles. So this piece I called Medicine Man. And I did it with my friend John Capellas, who was also HIV positive. And it's all my pill bottles. And when we finished the figure, it just wasn't complete. It wasn't quite right. And then we decided it needed a halo of syringes. And the halo is the shape of the mandorla, the almond shape that you often see the Virgin floating in the sky in this shape. It's a very powerful container. When this piece was shown at the museum, the guy who designed the exhibit put all the lighting in, and then he went to lunch, and this woman said, you know, would you mind if I relit it? And the other people there said, let her do it, she's really good. And she put like 3 times as much light on the sculpture as the previous guy did. And the syringes looked like shards of crystal. It just came to life. And I had never seen it that way because I don't have that kind of lighting in my studio. So it was a revelation. It was a new material, syringes, that I had fallen in love with as a piece of art. Now, don't worry, they're not sharp ends. I put little crystal beads at the end of, glued crystal beads at the end of each one. So to protect me and my assistants as we're installing. And these pieces have also traveled around the world. I was asked by a museum in South Africa to do one for them. And so this is Medicine Man 2.
And this is made up of the medicine bottles of South Africa?
No, this one is my medicine bottles again. I still have plenty left over. And there it's in the museum. One of them's in the museum in Durban, South Africa. Then the same curator was going to be doing another show in Cape Town and asked me if I would do a collaboration with South African artists. As you know, South Africa, the AIDS rate is very high. The area where I was visiting in Durban for the show, it's a province called KwaZulu-Natal. And 40% of the population of KwaZulu-Natal was HIV positive at that time. But what was happening there is the stigma was so heavy that people didn't know if each other was HIV positive. The guys who were helping me hang the work, I asked the curator, I said, are there any of them HIV positive? She said, I wouldn't know, they didn't talk about it. The other thing I found out was that the drugs that they were taking, the medications that were available to them, were the medications that had been stopped being used in the United States because they were too toxic. But we were shipping those old drugs overseas to them. So I created this piece in response. It was called Medicine Man for South Africa. You see the white disc below, that has the 7 major side effects of these drugs in different colors, and those spindle shapes, which are made by South African crafters out of beautiful glass beads. And all the bottles are from South African people with HIV, including the one at the top of the head, which is the Chief Justice of South Africa, Justice Cameron, who sent me one of his bottles. First openly HIV positive person in South Africa. And one time a group of women came in and they were all HIV positive while I was there. And I said, would you mind sharing your side effects? Because I had a pile of crayons there. And so people would write down their side effects of the drugs. And so we all sat down together and they were writing down their side effects and I was writing down my side effects, and they were the same. So here were these women from completely different culture than I was. And we formed a bond that was amazing, that I had never expected, and I don't think they had ever expected to have a bond with this Jewish guy from New York. So I can't remember which trip to South Africa was, but I got to go to a small fishing village called Kesikama, and this doctor had created this project called the Kesikama Altarpiece. All the women, many of whom in the village were HIV positive, would get together and sew this beautiful, huge altarpiece, which is based on the Isenheim altarpiece, same size, kept unfolding and unfolding. And it had images of the people in their community, dead and alive. But was going on in their community as they were together, sitting together, they were being educated about transmission of HIV from mother to child in utero transmission. So there was education, and also they got to talk about it. Before, which had been such a stigma, they were able to open up about their HIV. So in honor of them, I did a piece called Medicine Mother, also out of their medicine bottles.
And is the figure pregnant?
The figure is pregnant, yeah, very much so. Just about this time, which was what year?
2010.
Thank you. I don't remember dates. I was approached by the International AIDS Conference, which was going to be held in Vienna that year, and by UN AIDS to do an exhibition of these pieces. And so we showed several of them, but the one I did specifically for this exhibition was called Invisible Man. We're going to show a little movie that was sponsored by UN AIDS. It tells you a little bit more about the piece.
The inspiration for Invisible Man started with pieces I did back in the early 90s called the Icarian series. They are leather pieces from the gym that I went to here in San Francisco. Almost all the men who worked out at that gym are dead now. So their sweat and their strain got put into those pieces of leather, and their images are still there. So there's a theme that goes through a lot of my work, which I call the presence of absence. Recently, I was approached by Make Art Stop AIDS. I was asked to do a piece for the International AIDS Conference coming up in Vienna. And one of the main topics of that conference is going to be IV drug use. So I thought, wow, here's my chance to make a piece entirely out of syringes. These objects that in a certain way I've fallen in love with. They're just very powerful. What I wanted to create was a figure that was not there. Going back to the leather pieces, the presence of absence. So here is a figure that is surrounded by 864 syringes, but the figure's not there. It's negative space created by all these needles pointing in. When you have AIDS, you get stuck with needles a lot. People are taking blood, people are giving you shots, and that's another thing that this piece feels like to me. It's a porcupine, it's a pincushion, it's just like needles coming at me from every direction. The needles can be seen as rays of light. I think very often when people are confronted with a life-threatening illness, they have to make choices. They have to choose their priorities. And very often that causes people to become teachers and healers. So in that sense, they are taking that energy and they are pushing it out as rays of light, of healing light and energy. Any art about AIDS, hopefully if it works, it's taking an abstraction and turning it into something real. For so many people, AIDS is an abstraction. It's a number, or it's about somebody they don't know, but they go to an exhibition like this, they go to see one of these works, and it's real. That's what art can do.
So this is a picture of the exhibition in Vienna. And it was really interesting. People wanted to have their pictures taken with these things. It was like, really? Okay. I also got to do an exhibition just this last summer at another AIDS conference. And Make Art Stop AIDS was working with a photographer named Gideon Mendel. And what they were doing was traveling around the world to major cities where HIV was prevalent and working with HIV positive people and having them take pictures documenting their lives. And so they asked me to take some of these pictures and make art with them. So I made these mandalas. The theme of the part of the show that I was involved with was what keeps us alive. And so a lot of the photographs had to do with meditation, prayer. So I did a mandala about that. And these are quite large. And then another one was about family, community, what else keeps you alive? And I wanted the experience of people at the exhibition to, even if they were HIV negative, to figure out what is it that keeps us alive? What are the important things in our life that keep us alive? So I created this curtain wall out of these oval shapes. And we also, once again, put crayons out and had people write down what kept them alive. And as each layer was completed, we added another layer until the piece extended from the ceiling to the floor. What's this?
So Daniel has been included in a show that's traveling to about 4 different museums around the United States,
like
4 or 5 museums. It was a 2-year-long run, and the show was called Art AIDS America. It was put together by a guy named Dr. Jonathan David Katz, who's formerly at Yale. He's at the University of Buffalo now. And what it was the first major exhibition to really look at the impact that AIDS had, not only through the work of gay artists or those affected by the epidemic, but also sort of just the art world in general, but mostly focusing on HIV-positive artists, many of whom passed away.
Here's a little picture of the exhibition with one of the leather pieces in there. Some of the other artists who were in the exhibition, this symbol you may have seen was put up very early on in the AIDS epidemic all over New York. This is silence equals death. This was the time of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan did not mention the word AIDS until the very last year of his administration. And these people were basically demonstrating against the fact that his silence was equaling the death of their community. One of the most famous artists of this period is Keith Haring, who a lot of his late work was about HIV and AIDS. Another amazing artist is David Warnerowicz, who his late work was about his own impending death. Here, he took a picture of a diorama of buffalo being driven off of a cliff, and that's what he felt, that our community, we had basically, the government's ignorance, the government's ignoring us was driving us off the cliff. A very famous artist, Felix Gonzalez Torres, this piece is one of my favorite pieces of his. He took the body weight, the total body weight of he and his partner, who both were HIV positive, and created this corner mound of wrapped candy and invited people at the exhibition to take a piece with them and eat it or do whatever they want. So during the extent of the exhibition, this pile would get smaller and smaller, which was what was happening to he and his partner. They were wasting away and they both died.
But each time this piece is redone, and it is done frequently.
Yeah, it is reanimated with a whole new pile of candy. It's a very, very powerful piece. Lastly is Robert Mapplethorpe. All these artists that I've just mentioned all died before 1996. So here he's holding a death's head, very, very powerful image. One of the biggest art pieces that had to do with AIDS is the AIDS Memorial Quilt, which this is was in the Washington Mall. People would sew panels 3x6 of loved ones, co-workers who died of AIDS, and these panels were spread out, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands. It's a very, very powerful experience to be on, to experience this. And it was also a way of showing the extent of this epidemic, making you feel it, making it visceral.
But in thinking about how we mourn the dead or don't, these panels were made not only by gay people, they were made by
mothers,
family
daughters,
members,
families.
Friends. They were made by all of the people.
Yeah. And the panels aren't necessarily just gay people. There's lots of people who get HIV who are not gay. And in fact, predominantly, people who have HIV now are not gay. A movie came out a few years ago, which I really encourage you to see. It's streaming on Netflix. I happen to be in it. which is not why I'm telling you to see it. It's just actually an excellent movie. It tells the story of how San Francisco as a community came together, formed what is called the San Francisco model, where I don't know how many, 50 or 100 nonprofit groups rose up to take care of our community. It did not come from the top down. It came from the bottom up. Excellent movie. So at the same time, I started an organization called Visual Aid. I figured I needed to do something. So I'd start with my own community. I saw my friends who were artists, who were HIV positive, who couldn't afford art supplies. It was like either drugs or art supplies. So Visual Aid supplied art supplies to artists with life-threatening illnesses, women with cancer. It was across the board. I didn't feel we should discriminate just because you didn't have AIDS. And out of that grew another organization that I started called Visual Aid, which is a store. And we raised about $12 million over 20 years for nonprofits. And what was great about that is so many nonprofits had restricted funds or government funds just for one specific thing. We were able to give them unrestricted funds they could do with whatever they needed to do with them.
So we're going to end
soon.
Yeah, we're going to end soon. But we're going to talk about specifically for the last, 15, 20 years, you've predominantly done large-scale sculpture for healthcare facilities. I mean, and you didn't set out to do.
No, it's just that's who started approaching me, but it felt just right. I mean, I'm here because of the healthcare industry. I am alive because of my wonderful team of doctors, because of these amazing scientists who've been working so hard on these drugs. I wanted to be able to give back to that community somehow. And also, hospitals used to be very cold, unhealthy places, not healing places. And luckily, some studies came out, I think about 15, 20 years ago, showing that art in hospitals promotes healing, shortens hospital stays. So now they spend money on art. And they make hospitals beautiful places, healing places. And that is really, really important to me. That, first of all, my art gets to be experienced by people who wouldn't go to a museum, probably never been to a museum, that they have access to this work. I'm not going to tell you where these all are. They're in hospitals, medical schools, all over the country.
But there was a period where you sort of weren't making art, when the nonprofit world was where the focus was.
Yeah, for about 7 years, I pretty much stopped making art because my nonprofit work just seemed more important.
So this is the first piece that Daniel did for the Mayo Clinic.
And then I did another one for them, which is rather huge. It's about 90 feet long, for a new hospital there.
Well, in closing, would you just talk a little bit about the themes of these pieces? Because they all are sort of based on.
Well, they're, like I mentioned in the early movie, these are about permeability. These are about openness, about inviting you in. And that permeability is so important to me and to me, it feels very healing because these are large objects, but they're very light. And people have told me that they find them very healing. Anything else you wanted to say about them?
I've done one installation.
And
I said, if you want this marriage to last, never again.
Never again. It was terrible.
But I do have to say something really wonderful about the young man who's worked with Daniel well, he's not so young anymore.
We worked together about 16 years.
But John, the guy that Daniel worked with for a number of years, has a son named Corey. And Corey came to work with you about 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And John has been struggling with some really serious health issues over the last 8 years. And so, unfortunately, they could no longer work together. But Corey has essentially become your right-hand man. And these things really wouldn't exist without Corey.
No, he's been wonderful to work with. The most recent piece, which is coming soon, was just finished a couple of weeks ago for a neuroscience research center in St. Paul. And I was thrilled because I read a lot about neuroscience.
Here it is.
And
it's called Thoughts.
It's called Thoughts. It was about how thoughts travel through your nervous system. And when I did the presentation, I said, these are metaphors. And the head of the neuroscience said, no, that's really how it is. So where are we going from here?
I think
Almost
this
done.
is about it.
You want to see the newest pieces?
Well, this isn't about it.
No.
We've got 2 left.
My most recent body of work. Now, since we moved to Oregon, I've been working small again, which is thrilling. And so I've created these pieces which are made out of recycled glass.
And again, in thinking back to the Kabbalistic thing we were talking about earlier, the other way that tikkun olam can be translated is to construct for eternity. So again, the good works that you're doing as you help the Creator heal the world, you're actually constructing for eternity.
And these pieces are also, once again, reliquaries, but whereas the leather pieces were, physical relics of that time and of those people, I feel like these pieces they're holding my memories of my friends. And, maybe, it's hard to move on from, a great loss like that.
A very quick explanation. This is probably too much information, but Daniel's and I have both been sort of in love with a gentleman by the name of Ernst Haeckel, who was a German naturalist in the 19th century, who created these incredible watercolors of microscopic life.
And I've always been fascinated by them and also by X-rays. And I have sketchbooks filled with drawings that look just like my glass pieces, and I'd never been able to figure out how to make those drawings into reality until I started making these glass pieces. All the glass, by the way, is from Goodwill. I got to give them credit. Some of them get quite big. And then the last body of work are called Pillars of Cloud and Pillars of Fire. I have been obsessed with the idea of creating a pillar of fire for as long as I can remember, and have failed miserably every single time I tried. And I think I've gotten pretty close now to where I want it to be.
For those of you biblically inclined, the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud, or the theophany, as they say in Greek, are the manifestation of the Hebrew God as the children of Israel are led through the desert.
For 40 years.
For a secular guy, you've got a lot of religious themes.
Well, the
going
images
on.
in the Bible, I don't remember the stories, but I remember the images.
The images are so powerful.
Were so powerful and potent. So we're going to show you a very short
This is a pillar of fire in motion.
Yeah. This is using dichroic acrylic and nylon line. So once again, the piece is very permeable. It's always moving. Just a little bit of air current gets them moving.
And these are also a little bit higher than
they're about 7 feet tall. And they create great shadows on the wall.
This is a close-up of one of the pillars of cloud.
So you can see how they're made.
They're woven.
And then we'll just one of the clear ones. This does not have the color in it. This is the pillar of cloud. The other was the pillar of fire. And I guess I'm hoping that these pillars of cloud and fire will eventually lead me out of my own wilderness. And we'll see about that. I think that's pretty much it. If you feel like it, please feel free to ask some questions. We have a few minutes left. I really appreciate you inviting me. It's been really fun. Thank you.